Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
My sister wanted me to sell my house so she could have her dream wedding. And my mother thought that was perfectly reasonable. Not even a pause, not a blink, not a single moment of hesitation between Lily's absurd request and Mom's unwavering support. Just a straight face and a nod, like I'd been asked to pass the salt instead of sacrifice the only thing I owned outright, my modest, three-bedroom house that I worked 2 jobs and 7 years to pay off without help from a soul. That home wasn't just a roof over my head, it was my proof that every single hour of overtime, every missed vacation, every second I spent grinding instead of coasting had meant something. And now, apparently, I was supposed to toss it on the altar of Lily's Instagram-perfect wedding day like it was nothing but a generous family gesture. The conversation started on a Tuesday night, over dinner at Mom's place, one of those casual gatherings she pulls together when she's in the mood to play matriarch and remind us how much togetherness matters. It was just the three of us, Mom, Lily, and me, although it felt more like a tribunal than a meal. I should have known something was off the second Lily smiled, that sugar-coated smile of hers, the one she wears whenever she's about to ask for something outrageous and try to make it sound like a compliment. I've been thinking, she started, swirling her wine like she was on the damn set of a reality show. You know how expensive wedding venues are these days? Everything nice starts at, like, $70,000 minimum. It's insane. I nodded politely, pretending I didn't already know where this was heading, but my gut had already clenched tight like it always does when Lily begins a sentence with "I've been thinking." And then I remembered. "You've got that house," she said, her voice light, as if it were the most natural conclusion in the world. "It's paid off, right? You're not even married or anything, so you don't really need all that space. I mean, you could sell it, get a little apartment or something. You'd still have money left over, and we'd have the most incredible wedding ever. I'm talking dream venue, Emma, like, the kind people remember forever." I laughed at first. I genuinely thought she was joking. I even said, "That's a funny one, Lil," expecting her to giggle and move on to the next topic. But when I looked up and saw her dead serious face, eyes wide with expectation, my heart sank. And then my mother, without missing a beat, added her piece with a tone that was supposed to sound wise and nurturing, but felt more like pressure wrapped in a silk glove. "Your family, Emma," she said softly. "You make sacrifices. That's what you've always done. You've always been the dependable one." And there it was, the same line I'd been hearing in various forms since I was old enough to tie my own shoes. The dependable one. The solid one. The strong one. The one who stayed quiet, kept the peace, paid the bills, picked up the slack, and never made demands. Lily was the baby, the emotional one, the center of attention. I was the backdrop. I was the scaffolding holding the entire production together while she got the spotlight. I looked between them, Lily with her sparkling eyes and clueless entitlement, Mom with her guilt-laced logic and rehearsed moral high ground, and I realized they weren't even asking. Not really. They had already decided what the right thing was, and they fully expected me to fall in line, like I always had. They weren't thinking about what that house meant to me, what it had cost me to earn it, how much of myself I'd poured into every corner of it. They just saw a resource, something to be harvested for the family good. And I sat there in silence. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I didn't trust what would come out of my mouth if I opened it. I felt a heat building behind my eyes, the kind that usually signals tears, but this time it wasn't sadness, it was something else. Something heavier. Something colder. Something sharper. I stayed quiet, nodded once, and finished my dinner. But inside, something was shifting. Something permanent. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about how to keep the peace. I was thinking about how to start a fire. There's a very particular kind of discomfort that settles in during family dinners when love is no longer the main course, but guilt is baked into every damn bite. It's a slow burn, the kind that doesn't explode right away but builds quietly, meal after meal, word after carefully chosen word, until you can barely sit at the table without your stomach turning. That's exactly how things started to feel after I didn't immediately offer up my house like a sacrificial lamb to Lily's wedding altar. My silence, my simple, quiet, unwavering no, became the elephant in the room, but somehow I was the one being treated like the outsider. Marianne, my mother, didn't confront me outright. That's never been her style. She preferred to let her words drip slowly into conversation like poison, always indirect, always carefully phrased, but unmistakably loaded. She'd look at me from across the table and say things like, "I just think family means doing hard things for each other sometimes," or, "When you love someone, you show it in actions, not just words." Always vague enough to deny if questioned, but always sharp enough to make its mark. The guilt was never yelled. It was served with a smile and a side dish. Lily, of course, knew exactly how to take the baton and run with it. She turned every gathering into a performance, her emotions turned up to 11, dabbing her eyes dramatically at even the smallest mention of wedding stress. "It's just hard," she'd say, forcing her voice to quiver while glancing around the room to make sure she had an audience. "I thought we were closer than this, Emma. I really did. I thought you'd be happy for me." It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, complete with fake tears, prolonged silences, and carefully planted accusations that never sounded like accusations. "I'm not trying to guilt you," she said one night, her voice soft and trembling just enough to be believable. I guess I didn't realize how little you cared about my happiness." And that was the moment it became clear. This wasn't about the wedding anymore. It wasn't even about the money. It was about control. It was about reminding me of my place in the family hierarchy, where I was always expected to sacrifice quietly while others got to be loud and adored. Have you ever said no just once and watched the whole family turn on you like you'd betrayed the country? Like a single act of self-preservation made you the villain in a story you didn't even ask to be written into? That's what it felt like. Not just disappointing them, but daring to challenge the script I'd been cast in since childhood. Still, I said nothing. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I felt everything. I absorbed every dig, every passive comment, every guilt-laced sigh, and filed them away in the back of my mind like receipts. And while they all thought I was folding, while they whispered among themselves that maybe I was just taking time to come around, something else was happening, something none of them could see. I started taking calls in the middle of the day, stepping into the other room, closing the door behind me. I started working late, staying out longer, telling them I had projects keeping me busy. I smiled at dinners. I nodded politely. I even asked about floral arrangements just to keep the peace. But beneath the surface, I wasn't just enduring anymore, I was building something. Preparing something. Waiting. Because while they were busy twisting emotional knives, I was quietly reaching for the matchbook. And soon enough, I was going to light the fuse. There's something liberating about moving in silence, about letting people underestimate you just long enough for them to start believing their own fantasies about who you are and what you're worth. While my mother and sister kept applying pressure with their guilt-laced demands and emotional theatrics, I quietly started orchestrating something far more satisfying than an argument. I wasn't just going to say no, I was going to flip the entire narrative, and I was going to do it without raising my voice once. Because if they wanted a storybook ending so badly, I was damn well going to write the final chapter myself. So one afternoon, without telling anyone where I was going, I drove across town to the wedding venue Lily had been drooling over for weeks. She'd shown me pictures of it during her dramatic monologues: arched stone walls, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens, a grand ballroom dripping in crystal chandeliers. "It's the kind of place that makes people cry just walking in," she'd said breathlessly, like the venue itself would somehow compensate for everything else her relationship lacked. I pulled up to the property quietly, parked around the side where no one could see my car, and walked through the gates like any other prospective client. The lobby was as lavish as I remembered: polished wood floors, gold-accented decor, soft music playing in the background like it had been choreographed for an expensive perfume commercial. A young receptionist greeted me politely and offered to have someone show me around, and I nodded, not offering much more than a smile. I didn't need to be walked through the place. I already knew every inch of it. But I let them do their job, Let them point out the obvious highlights. Let them treat me like a guest, because it served the bigger purpose. Then, just as we were passing the garden terrace, a familiar voice called out from behind me, steady, warm, unmistakably amused. Well, took you long enough. I turned to see James walking toward me with that same sly smirk he'd worn the day we signed the original paperwork years ago. Tall, clean-cut, with the air of someone who could charm a room without saying much at all. He was my business partner, though you'd never know it from any website or formal record. Years ago, when I came into a small inheritance and didn't know what to do with it, James had approached me with a proposal. He was purchasing shares in a property, a rundown estate he believed could become something elite, an event venue unlike anything else in the area. I had trusted him. I had invested quietly under a different name, and I had let him run the show while I stayed behind the curtain. And now, that same property was the crown jewel of wedding venues, Lily's fantasy venue. We walked back to his office, tucked away behind the main ballroom, and closed the door. The second we sat down, he leaned forward and grinned. "Tell me what's going on," he said, half laughing already. "Because I've got a stack of emails from your sister's wedding planner, and it's taking everything in me not to laugh every time they gush about how honored they are to host her wedding here." I shrugged, barely containing my own smirk. "They think I'm selling my house to fund it." His eyebrows shot up, amused. "Seriously?" "Seriously. And your mother's on board with this?" he asked, half in disbelief, half in that familiar tone of protective rage he'd always reserved for stories about my family. "Oh, she thinks I should feel honored to sacrifice for my sister's fairy tale," I said dryly. "Apparently, I've always been the strong one." He leaned back in his chair, shook his head, and laughed. "So what's the plan?" I looked around the office, letting the moment sit in the air for a second, letting the absurdity of it all soak into my bones. "We let her book it," I said finally, voice steady. "No interference. No discounts. Full price. Every single dollar." He nodded slowly, already reading between the lines. "And when she gets here?" "She'll find out," I said with a smile that wasn't even close to warm. "Eventually." James hesitated for a moment, then narrowed his eyes. "Are we really doing this?" "You sure?" And I just smiled wider, eyes locked on his. "Let's see how much she really wants it." Because if they wanted me to make a sacrifice, they were going to learn, painfully, that I'd already made mine years ago. And this time, I was the one writing the script. There's a certain satisfaction in watching people celebrate a victory they didn't actually win, especially when they believe it was wrestled from your reluctant hands, when in truth, you handed it to them like a gift-wrapped grenade with a timer ticking quietly beneath the ribbon. After weeks of pressure and passive-aggressive dinners and pity-laced sighs, I finally decided it was time to give them what they wanted, or at least let them believe I had. I called my mother on a rainy Thursday afternoon, made sure my tone was just soft enough to sound defeated, just weary enough to seem like I'd finally caved beneath the unbearable weight of familial guilt. I even let a little sigh slip through the line, not because I was tired of them, but because I was tired of pretending to be the person they thought I still was. "I'll figure something out," I told her, pausing for dramatic effect. "If it means that much to Lily, I'll make it happen." The silence that followed was short but heavy, like she was waiting to make sure she'd heard me correctly. Then came the warmth, manufactured, glowing, triumphant. "Oh, Emma, that means so much," she said, her voice softening in that way she always used when she thought she'd won. "You're doing the right thing. You'll see. Family is everything." I held the phone to my ear and nodded, even though she couldn't see me, murmuring polite acknowledgments while she praised my generosity and talked about how proud my late father would have been. I kept my voice neutral, played the part perfectly, never once letting on that the real plan had already been set in motion weeks earlier when I'd signed the venue booking contract, not as a favor, but as a business transaction under my own terms, and with my own name printed neatly at the bottom. The deposit was paid, the date secured, and the venue staff instructed to treat every inquiry from Lily's planner as just another full-price booking from a standard client. What neither my mother nor my sister knew What none of them had even thought to question was that the only reason Lily was even able to book the venue of her dreams was because I had quietly allowed it. The real favor wasn't in the check I never wrote or the house I never sold. It was in the silence I maintained while they strutted through their imagined victory parade. And oh, how they strutted. Lily went from weepy little martyr to gloating princess overnight. She posted updates on social media daily, selfies at the venue gates, videos of her gushing over floral arrangements, blurry pictures of tasting menus captioned, "Living the dream," and "Manifesting the perfect day." Her friends commented things like, "You deserve it, girl," and "So happy for you," while she soaked up the validation like it was a spa treatment. She even tagged me once in a post, calling me the best big sister in the world, with a heart emoji and a photo of the venue's ballroom, as if my silence had suddenly made me worthy of a little praise. And still, I said nothing. Because the truth was, I didn't care if they believed they'd won. I didn't care if they thought I'd folded or relented or finally realized the importance of sacrifice. Let them believe whatever made them sleep better at night. What mattered was that the day was coming, the one they'd built up in their minds as a flawless fantasy, the day where Lily would walk into that venue thinking she had conquered something, only to be met with a truth she couldn't spin, hide, or cry her way out of. The night before the wedding, as I poured a glass of wine and settled into my reading chair, my phone buzzed with a message from James. "Her face tomorrow is going to be priceless." And I smiled, not because I wanted revenge, but because I had given them exactly what they asked for. They just didn't realize it came with my name on the door. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of crisp, cloudless sky that photographers dream about and bridezillas demand from the universe as some kind of divine compensation for their months of Pinterest-fueled stress. Everything looked picture-perfect, exactly the way Lily had imagined it, draped in white roses and soft champagne linens, string lights glistening in the morning sun, and a soundtrack of harp music floating through the air like the opening credits of a romantic drama. The venue sparkled, and so did Lily, fluttering around in her satin robe, barking last-minute orders, flailing over centerpieces, and checking her reflection in every reflective surface she could find. From the outside, it was a fairy tale. From the inside, it was a circus fueled by caffeine, hairspray, and pure delusion. I arrived quietly, dressed in a simple navy dress, my heels clicking softly against the marble floors as I made my way through the venue entrance. I kept my expression neutral, not smiling, not frowning, just calm. Controlled. Composed. The kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly what's coming next while everyone else still thinks they're the star of the show. As I entered the main hall, I saw Lily across the room surrounded by her bridal party, frantically gesturing toward a misplaced bouquet as if the entire wedding would crumble if the hydrangeas were 2 inches to the left. She didn't see me at first, which gave me a perfect moment to take it all in, the guests arriving, the caterers moving like clockwork, the soft hum of excitement that filled every corner of the space. Everything was perfect. And everything was mine. Then it happened. A staff member walked by, holding a clipboard and chatting with another server about champagne service. She wore a standard black blazer, dark slacks, and a small name badge pinned neatly to her chest. It was unassuming, nothing flashy. But the second Lily's eyes caught sight of it, her world shifted. I saw it like it happened in slow motion, her gaze landing on the badge, her smile faltering mid-sentence, her lips parting slightly as her eyes focused on the words printed in clean white text, "Emma Carter, so owner." Her entire face changed in an instant. She went pale, eyes wide, mouth slightly agape as if the badge had just slapped her across the face. She blinked once, then twice, as if trying to unsee what she had clearly read. I didn't move. I didn't rush toward her or try to explain it away. I just stood there, letting her absorb the truth that had been sitting right under her nose the entire time. She looked around wildly, trying to find someone to confirm it wasn't real, that it was some coincidence, that there must be another Emma Carter, someone else entirely. But then her eyes met mine. I didn't say anything. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I simply walked over, offered her a soft, polite smile, and said, Congratulations, Lily. It's a beautiful day. Then I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with a face full of panic and a bouquet clutched in trembling hands. I could feel the whispers starting before I even made it halfway across the room. A few guests looked toward me, then back toward the staff badge. I heard one of Lily's bridesmaids ask, "Wait, is that her sister? Did she say co-owner?" Another murmured, "I thought Lily said she paid for the venue herself," and the murmurs began to spread like a quiet ripple through the perfectly arranged chairs and curated smiles. Marianne looked confused at first, glancing around like she'd missed something, her brows furrowed as she caught pieces of the whispers and stared after me. But I never broke stride. I never said another word. I didn't need to. The truth was walking through the room on its own, wearing a name badge and carrying my silence like a weapon sharper than any insult I could have hurled at that dinner table months ago. The ceremony continued, awkwardly at first, then regaining momentum as people settled into their roles again. Lily walked down the aisle with her practiced smile back in place, but the edges were tighter now, the gleam in her eyes slightly dulled by the weight of what she'd learned, that the very dream she thought she'd manipulated out of me had never truly been hers to begin with. That everything she thought I had given up for her had never really belonged to her in the first place. Later that night, after the dancing and the speeches and the carefully posed photos, Lily cornered me in one of the side rooms. Her hair was tousled from the wind, her heels in her hand, and her voice a breathy whisper coated in rage and confusion. "Why didn't you tell me?" I tilted my head, pretending not to understand. "Tell you what?" She took a shaky step closer, eyes flashing. "That you own this place." I looked at her calmly, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, and said, "You asked for a dream wedding. I made sure you got it." And that was all I said before turning and walking away again. Because the truth was already out. And I didn't owe her a damn thing more. There's something oddly satisfying about watching people scramble to rebuild a narrative they can live with after the truth has already cracked it wide open in public. In the weeks following the wedding, the whispers kept coming, guests asking subtle questions, coworkers nudging for confirmation, family friends raising eyebrows over what they'd seen and heard on that perfectly choreographed day. But Lily and Marianne? They did what they always did when reality didn't fit the image they'd spent years constructing. They pretended it didn't happen. They never asked about the badge again. They never mentioned the nameplate on the door or the hushed conversations they'd overheard. They went radio silent for days, then resumed their usual tone, as if nothing had changed, as if the entire thing had been some curious misunderstanding that didn't deserve air. But I knew better. The silence between us was no longer polite, it was permanent. It wasn't the kind that passes. It was the kind that sets roots, settles deep, and rewrites what people expect of you forever. And I had never been more comfortable inside it. What they didn't know, what I didn't feel obligated to share, is that just weeks after the wedding, I finalized the paperwork to sell my ownership share in the venue. It wasn't a rushed decision or an emotional exit. It was strategy. James had already been talking with another investor, someone who wanted in at a higher valuation now that our bookings were through the roof, and I figured, why not let Lily's ridiculous fairy tale be my final contribution to that chapter? I signed the documents, cashed out my share, and walked away with a very healthy profit ironically funded, in part, by the very family that had once tried to shame me into giving away my home. And the best part? I didn't say a word about it to anyone. Not a single boast, not a single "I told you so." No grand declarations or sarcastic jabs. Just clean, calculated distance. I didn't need them to acknowledge what had happened. I didn't need an apology or validation or even thanks. Because something deeper had shifted, something far more important than the balance of power at a dinner table. They stopped asking me for things. They stopped expecting me to carry the burden. They stopped assuming I'd show up with a blank check and a forced smile. And without ever yelling, without slamming a door or delivering a tear-filled speech, I had changed the rules of engagement. I wasn't the fixer anymore. I was the one who chose what stayed in my hands and what didn't. The months passed. Holidays came and went, a little colder than before, fewer invites, more strained greetings, but I welcomed the space. My life didn't shrink, it expanded. I took a vacation to Italy that spring, finally used the kitchen remodel fund I'd been putting off, and started writing again, something I hadn't done in years. I slept better. I laughed more. And I stopped carrying weight that wasn't mine. But families have a funny way of circling back to old patterns, especially when they think time has softened your edges. Almost exactly a year after the wedding, I got a text from an old colleague who'd heard something amusing through the grapevine. Apparently, Lily had tried to book the same venue again, this time for her baby shower. She hadn't realized the change in ownership. She hadn't expected the rates to shift. But when her planner inquired, she was told the price had nearly doubled under the new management. Peak season pricing. No exceptions. No discounts. No family rate. Just a standard, full-price quote sent to her inbox like she was any other hopeful client on the list. I didn't laugh. I didn't gloat. But I will admit, I poured a second glass of wine that night with a little extra satisfaction in the pour. Then, as if right on cue, I received a message from my mother, one of those short, passive-aggressive notes she always sends when she's pretending not to be bitter but still needs to poke the wound. You didn't have to make a point, Emma. I stared at the message for a moment, felt the weight of everything she didn't say sitting beneath those words, and then slowly hit delete without replying. And as I leaned back in my chair, took a sip of wine, and watched the sun slide behind the trees outside my window, I said it out loud to no one in particular. Actually, I did. Because for years, I had swallowed my tongue to keep the peace, bent myself backward to avoid offending, sacrificed and smiled through every unreasonable ask. And all that silence had cost me more than any mortgage or wedding venue ever could. Was it petty? Maybe. But sometimes dignity costs more than a house, and I finally stopped paying in silence.